The beacon flashed once, then twice, then nothing. Lieutenant Commander Mika Raven Vasquez pressed her eyes shut against the instrument panel's dying glow, feeling the F-18E Super Hornet shudder around her like a wounded animal. 3 miles below, the Pacific stretched endlessly, its dark surface promising nothing but cold finality. Her radio crackled with static, then fell silent. For the first time in her 15-year career, Raven was truly alone. The mission had been routine, a simple reconnaissance flight over contested airspace near the Aleutian Islands. Intelligence suggested Russian Tu-95 Bears were testing American response times again, probing for weaknesses in NORAD's northern radar coverage. Raven had drawn the short straw, launching solo from the USS Gerald R. Ford at 5:30 hours, while most of the squadron slept off hangovers from the previous night's celebration of Lieutenant Kowalski's promotion. Nobody expected her to encounter the ghost. The unidentified aircraft had appeared on her radar at 35,000 feet, moving at impossible speeds. No heat signature, no transponder code, no response to radio hails. Just a blip that shouldn't exist, dancing across her display like a digital phantom. When she'd requested permission to investigate, Control had denied her immediately. Negative, Raven, return to base. Weather's deteriorating. But Raven had seen something else on that screen, a flight pattern that reminded her of her father's old war stories, tales of pilots who vanished into the Alaskan wilderness and were never found. The ghost moved like it was lost, circling, searching. Against orders, she'd climbed to intercept. Now her engines were failing, her navigation systems were dark, and her fuel gauge read empty when it should have shown 3 hours remaining. The last transmission she'd received was from her wingman, call sign Phantom, reporting her as missing. Search and rescue would launch within the hour, but in these conditions, with visibility near zero and storms building from the northwest, they'd be flying blind. Raven checked her emergency beacon, still functional, still broadcasting. If she went down, they'd find the wreckage eventually. But something about this situation felt wrong, calculated, as if the ghost aircraft had deliberately led her into this trap. Her instruments flickered back to life for a moment, showing impossible readings. According to the display, she was flying at 60,000 feet, well beyond her aircraft's service ceiling. The beacon flashed again, and this time she realized it wasn't coming from her plane. 60 miles away, aboard the Ford, Admiral Hendricks studied the radar screens with growing concern. Raven's transponder had vanished 20 minutes ago, but now something else was showing up, multiple contacts moving in formation, all broadcasting the same emergency frequency. Whatever was happening out there, it was about to become a lot more complicated. From the flight deck, the first F-18 Super Hornets began launching into the storm. The morning briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as pilots gathered around the tactical display. Commander Jackson, the Air Group's senior pilot, traced the search grid with his finger while weather reports painted an increasingly grim picture. Wind speeds at altitude were approaching dangerous levels, and visibility was dropping by the hour. Raven's last known position puts her here, Jackson said, tapping the screen. But we've got multiple radar contacts in the area, all showing the same emergency beacon signature. Could be equipment malfunction, could be something else entirely. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Phantom's usual wingman, raised her hand. Sir, what about the unidentified aircraft she was tracking? Any word from Air Force intelligence? Jackson's expression darkened. Classified. All we know is that Raven violated direct orders to investigate and now she's missing. Our job is to bring her home. In the back of the room, Chief Petty Officer Martinez, the squadron's longest-serving crew chief, watched the display with knowing eyes. He'd seen this before, pilots vanishing in the Aleutians, radar contacts that made no sense, equipment failures that defied explanation. The old-timers called it the Devil's Triangle of the North, though officially no such designation existed. The first search flight launched at 800 hours, 4 Super Hornets in formation, led by Commander Jackson himself. As they climbed through the storm clouds, their radios crackled with interference that seemed almost intentional, patterns of static that reminded Jackson of old World War II transmissions he'd studied at the Naval War College. "Control, this is Search Leader," Jackson radioed. "We're approaching the last known coordinates. Weather is deteriorating, but we're maintaining formation." "Roger, Search Leader. Be advised, we're picking up intermittent radar contacts in your area. Recommend extreme caution." Through the gray soup of clouds and precipitation, Jackson caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. A metallic glint, moving parallel to their course at the same altitude. His wingman, Lieutenant Rodriguez, saw it too. "Search Leader, I've got visual on an unidentified aircraft, bearing 270. Configuration unknown." Jackson squinted through his canopy, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The aircraft appeared to be roughly the same size as an F-18, but its lines were all wrong, too smooth, too angular, as if it had been designed by someone who understood aerodynamics but had never seen a conventional fighter jet. "Control, Search Leader. We have visual contact with unknown aircraft, requesting instructions." The response was immediate and chilling. "Search Leader, Control. We show no aircraft in your vicinity. Repeat, no aircraft on scope." Jackson's blood ran cold. Either their radar was malfunctioning, or something was actively jamming their systems. But how could that be possible at this altitude in these weather conditions? As he watched, the mysterious aircraft rolled inverted and dove toward the ocean's surface, disappearing into the storm clouds below. Then his radio burst to life with a familiar voice. Any station, this is Raven. If anyone can hear this, I'm alive, but I need immediate assistance." The search for Lieutenant Commander Mika Vasquez had officially begun. Raven's voice cut through the static like a blade through silk, but something about the transmission bothered Jackson immediately. The signal was too clear, too strong for someone supposedly flying a damaged aircraft in the middle of a storm. He'd known Raven for 3 years, had flown with her on countless missions, and while she was unquestionably skilled, she'd always been something of an outsider. The daughter of a missing Vietnam War pilot, Raven had joined the Navy with a chip on her shoulder and something to prove. Her father, Captain Eduardo Vasquez, had vanished over Laos in 1972, leaving behind only questions and a young daughter who grew up staring at the sky, wondering if he was still out there somewhere. The Navy had been her way of following in his footsteps, but also her way of finding answers that had eluded 3 generations of her family. "Raven, this is Search Leader," Jackson transmitted. "What is your status? We have your position marked, but we're not seeing you on radar." "Search Leader, I'm flying at Angel 60, approximately 40 miles northeast of last reported position. I have multiple system failures, but engines are stable. There's something else up here, something you need to know about." Angel 60 meant 60,000 feet, impossible for an F-18 without afterburners, and Raven should have been running on fumes by now. Jackson exchanged glances with his wingman, both thinking the same thing. This didn't add up. "Raven, confirm your altitude. You're showing 60,000. "Affirmative, Search Leader. I know how it sounds, but my instruments are reading correctly. The aircraft I was tracking, it's still here. I think it's been jamming our communications, but now it's trying to help me get home." In the Carrier Intelligence Center, Commander Elizabeth Garrett studied the electronic warfare displays with growing alarm. The interference patterns they were detecting were unlike anything in their database, sophisticated, adaptive, almost organic in nature. Whatever was generating the jamming was learning from their countermeasures, evolving its techniques in real time. "Admiral," she called to Hendricks, who was monitoring the search operation from the bridge. "We need to talk. These radar signatures aren't matching anything in our identification database, and the electronic warfare characteristics. Sir, they're not consistent with any known aircraft." Hendricks descended to the intelligence center, his weathered face grim. At 62, he'd seen everything the modern Navy had to offer, from the final days of the Cold War to the current tensions with China and Russia. But this situation felt different, older somehow, like an echo from a forgotten conflict. "What are we looking at, Commander?" Garrett pulled up a series of spectral analysis charts. The jamming signatures were detecting show technological sophistication beyond current known capabilities. The frequency hopping patterns are too complex, too adaptive. It's as if the aircraft is analyzing our electronics and developing countermeasures faster than our computers can track. Above them, Raven's transmission continued. "Search leader, the pilot of the unknown aircraft is attempting to communicate with me through light signals. I think he wants me to follow him." Jackson keyed his mic. "Negative, Raven. Maintain your current heading. We'll vector to your position for visual contact." But even as he spoke, Jackson knew something fundamental had changed. This was no longer a simple search and rescue operation. They were dealing with technology that defied explanation, and Raven was at the center of it all. The storm was intensifying, and time was running out. At 60,000 feet, Raven found herself in a world of impossible beauty. Above the storm clouds, the sky was crystalline blue, and the mysterious aircraft flew beside her like a metallic angel. Its pilot had been flashing lights at her for the past 10 minutes, a complex pattern that seemed almost like Morse code, but not quite. The rhythm was familiar, reminding her of something from her childhood. Her father's old flight jacket had hung in their hallway closet for 30 years, never worn, never moved. On quiet evenings, young Mika would sit beside it, running her fingers over the patches and pins, while her mother told stories of the brave pilot who'd never come home. One patch had always fascinated her, a squadron insignia featuring a black raven in flight, wings spread against a silver moon. The 390th Tactical Fighter Squadron, known as the Night Ravens. Now, as the unknown aircraft continued its light signals, Raven realized the pattern matched something she'd memorized years ago: her father's personal call sign sequence, a unique identifier he developed during his missions over Southeast Asia. 3 long flashes, 2 short, 1 long. The signature of Captain Eduardo "Nighthawk" Vasquez. Her hands trembled on the controls as the implications hit her. The aircraft beside her wasn't just unknown, it was impossible. The lines were too clean, the materials too advanced, the flight characteristics too perfect. It moved through the air like physics was merely a suggestion, banking and rolling with movements that should have torn any pilot apart with G-forces. "Unknown aircraft," she transmitted on guard frequency, her voice barely steady. "If you can hear this, flash your lights twice if you understand." The response was immediate. 2 brilliant pulses of light from what appeared to be the cockpit. Are you Captain Eduardo Vasquez?" This time the lights flashed in the old pattern, 3 long, 2 short, 1 long. Raven's training warred with her emotions. Every rational part of her mind insisted this was impossible. Hallucinations brought on by oxygen deprivation, stress-induced psychological breaks, equipment failures creating false readings. But her heart recognized something deeper, a connection that transcended logic and physics. Below them, the search aircraft were climbing through the storm, their radar signatures appearing on her display as they fought through the turbulence. Jackson's voice crackled through the static. "Raven, we're approaching your coordinates. Can you give us a reference point?" She looked at the aircraft beside her, its pilot clearly visible in the cockpit now. The flight suit was wrong, too old, too faded, and the helmet bore markings she'd only seen in museums. But the face was achingly familiar, aged and weathered but unmistakably the same features she saw in photographs every day. "Search leader, I'm going to need you to trust me. I'm following the unknown aircraft to a heading of 090. It appears to be leading me toward clearer weather." "Negative, Raven. Maintain your position until we have visual contact." But Raven was already banking to starboard, following the ghost aircraft as it descended through a gap in the clouds she hadn't noticed before. As they dropped below the storm layer, she saw something that made her gasp. A small island, unmarked on any chart, with what appeared to be a landing strip carved into its rocky surface. The ghost aircraft was leading her home, but to where, and to what truth about her father's disappearance she could only guess. The island emerged from the mist like something from a dream, its edges soft and indistinct in the gray morning light. Raven's fuel gauge still read impossible numbers, but her engines were running smoothly as she followed the mysterious aircraft in a gentle descent toward the landing strip. The runway appeared to be carved directly from black volcanic rock, its surface smooth and unmarked by any visible wear. Search leader, I have visual on a landing field. The unknown aircraft is apparently guiding me to a safe landing. Jackson's voice was tight with concern. Raven, we're not showing any landmass at your coordinates. What is your exact position? She read off her GPS coordinates, but even as she spoke, she knew they wouldn't make sense to anyone else. The island felt like it existed in a pocket of space that normal instruments couldn't detect, a place where the rules of physics bent just enough to allow the impossible. The ghost aircraft touched down first, its landing flawless despite the crosswind she could feel buffeting her own plane. As it rolled to a stop, she could see the pilot through the canopy, gesturing for her to follow. Something about his movements, the way he held his head, confirmed what her heart had already accepted. Her F-18 touched the volcanic runway with barely a bump, the strange surface providing perfect traction. As she rolled to a stop behind the other aircraft, she noticed details that shouldn't exist. The runway lights were powered by some unknown source, the marking paint was fresh despite no visible maintenance facilities, and the ghost aircraft itself seemed to shimmer slightly, as if it wasn't quite solid. She shut down her engines and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, breathing heavily through her oxygen mask. 35 years of questions were about to be answered, but part of her was terrified of what those answers might be. The ghost pilot had climbed out of his aircraft and was walking toward her, removing his helmet as he approached. Even at a distance, she could see the family resemblance. The same dark hair, the same lean build, the same confident stride she'd inherited. But he looked exactly as he had in the last photograph taken before his final mission, unchanged by the decades that should have aged him. Raven popped her canopy and climbed down from her aircraft, her legs unsteady on the strange volcanic surface. The air was warm despite their altitude, and she could hear sounds that shouldn't exist, distant music, voices speaking in languages she couldn't identify, the hum of technology that seemed both ancient and impossibly advanced. Mika, her father said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. I've been waiting for you. Overhead, the storm clouds parted just enough to reveal the search aircraft circling in confusion, their pilots reporting no visual contact and no radar returns. From their perspective, Raven had simply vanished into empty air, her last transmission fading into static. But on the impossible island, father and daughter walked toward each other across 35 years of separation, while questions that had haunted 3 generations of their family finally prepared to reveal their answers. The reunion was everything and nothing like she'd imagined. Her father looked exactly as he had in the photographs from 1972, but his eyes held depths of experience that spoke of decades of impossible adventures. When they embraced, she could feel that he was solid, real, warm. Not a ghost or hallucination, but somehow genuinely her father, preserved in time. "How is this possible?" she whispered against his shoulder. Eduardo stepped back, his hands still on her arms, studying her face with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "The same way you're here, Mija. The same way this island exists. The same way I've been able to watch you grow up from a place outside normal time. There are gaps in reality, thin places where the impossible becomes inevitable." Around them, the island hummed with quiet activity. She could see figures moving in the distance, other pilots, other aircraft, all somehow displaced from their own times and places. Some of the planes were clearly from World War II, others looked like they belonged centuries in the future. All bore the same subtle shimmer she'd noticed in her father's aircraft. "The Night Ravens," Eduardo explained, seeing her gaze. "We didn't disband when the war ended. We evolved, became something else. Guardians, you might say. Watchers over pilots who find themselves lost between worlds." "But why now? Why reveal yourself to me?" His expression grew serious. "Because something is changing. The barriers between realities are weakening, and soon this place won't be able to remain hidden. Your generation will need to decide whether to let these gaps close forever or step through and become part of something larger." Above them, she could hear the distant sound of search aircraft, their pilots growing increasingly frustrated as they found no trace of her. She knew she had to make a choice: return to her own reality and try to explain the unexplainable, or step fully into this impossible world her father had found. "What about my life, my career, the people who depend on me?" Eduardo smiled, the same expression she remembered from childhood photographs. "The choice isn't permanent, Mija. Time moves differently here. You could spend years learning about this place and return to find only minutes have passed in your world, but you need to understand what you'd be inheriting." He led her toward a structure that seemed to phase in and out of visibility, a hangar or operations center built from materials that defied classification. Inside, she could see dozens of pilots from different eras, all wearing variations of the Night Raven insignia, all studying displays that showed conflicts across time and space. "We watch for pilots who become lost, who push the boundaries too far and find themselves displaced. Sometimes we guide them home. Sometimes we invite them to join us. Always, we learn from what we see." Raven looked at the assembled pilots, men and women from across decades of military aviation, all united by their willingness to fly into the unknown. She recognized the look in their eyes, the same restless hunger that had driven her to violate orders and pursue the ghost aircraft. Her radio crackled with Jackson's increasingly urgent transmissions. "Raven, if you can hear this, we're running low on fuel. We need your position immediately." She keyed her mic. "Search leader, I'm safe. I need 30 more minutes, then I'll be ready for escort home." "Negative, Raven. We need visual contact now." Her father touched her shoulder. "The choice is yours, but it must be made freely. Your friends will wait. Time has a way of bending around necessity." Above them, the impossible sky waited for her decision. 30 minutes became 3 hours in the space between heartbeats. On the island that existed outside normal time, Raven learned about the Night Raven's true mission. They were guardians of the gaps, protectors of pilots who pushed too far into the unknown and found themselves lost between realities. Her father had been their newest recruit in 1972, vanishing over Laos not because he'd been shot down, but because he discovered one of the thin places and stepped through. "Every generation faces the choice," Eduardo explained as they walked through the hangar filled with impossible aircraft. "Accept the boundaries of known physics or push beyond them and risk everything. Most pilots never encounter the gaps, but those who do, those who are willing to fly into mystery itself, they're the ones we watch for." The assembled pilots came from across the spectrum of aviation history. She met Colonel Margaret Whitman, who disappeared during a 1943 test flight, and discovered she could pilot aircraft that wouldn't be invented for decades. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison had vanished during the Korean War, only to find himself capable of flying missions across time itself, preventing conflicts that history would never record. "But what about consequences?" Raven asked. "If you can change things, prevent wars, save lives, doesn't that alter history?" Morrison smiled grimly. "History is more resilient than you'd think. We can prevent individual tragedies, guide lost pilots home, even stop small conflicts from escalating. But the big patterns, the major currents of time, those flow around our interventions like water around stones. Through the translucent walls of the hangar, she could see her F-18 and her father's mysterious aircraft side by side. Both planes seemed to pulse with the same energy that permeated the island, as if they'd been transformed by their presence in this impossible place. "Your aircraft has been enhanced," Eduardo said, noticing her gaze. "It will still function normally in your reality, but now it can also navigate the gaps when necessary. The choice to use those capabilities will always be yours." A soft alarm chimed through the hangar, and the assembled pilots began moving toward their aircraft with practiced efficiency. On the tactical displays, Raven could see multiple situations developing across the globe: a lost training flight over the Sahara, a malfunctioning experimental aircraft over the North Pole, a civilian pilot who'd inadvertently stumbled into restricted airspace and was about to trigger an international incident. "Every day brings new challenges," Morrison said, suiting up in gear that seemed to shift and adapt to whatever aircraft he'd be flying. "Lost souls looking for home, conflicts that could be prevented, mysteries that need unraveling. It's not an easy life, but it's a necessary one." Raven felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. Above them, she knew Jackson and the search aircraft were still circling, their fuel running low, their concern for her growing by the minute. She had responsibilities in her own reality, squadron mates who depended on her, missions that needed flying, a career that had taken 15 years to build. But she also had a heritage she'd never known existed, a legacy that stretched back through generations of aviators who'd chosen to fly beyond the boundaries of the possible. Her father's disappearance suddenly made sense, not as a tragedy, but as a transformation. "If I choose to stay, what happens to them?" She gestured upward toward the sound of circling aircraft. "Time will adjust," Eduardo said gently. "You'll appear exactly where and when you need to, with a story they can accept. The gaps protect themselves and us by providing reasonable explanations for the impossible." The decision had been made before she consciously realized it. This was what she'd been searching for her entire life, not just her father, but her purpose. She was meant to be here, among the pilots who flew between worlds, protecting those who pushed too far and found themselves lost in the spaces between reality. But first, she had to return to her own world and complete her current mission. The Night Ravens could wait a little longer for their newest member. The return to normal reality was like waking from a vivid dream. One moment Raven was standing beside her father on the volcanic runway of an impossible island. The next she was alone in her F-18 cockpit, flying straight and level through clear skies. Her instruments read normal, altitude 25,000 feet, fuel at expected levels for her mission profile, all systems functioning within parameters. But everything had changed. She could feel the difference in her aircraft, a subtle responsiveness that hadn't been there before. The controls seemed more sensitive, more intuitive, as if the plane was now an extension of her thoughts rather than just a machine she operated. And there was something else, a new awareness, like a sixth sense that told her about gaps in reality, thin places where the impossible might become inevitable. Her radio crackled with Jackson's voice. "Raven, where the hell have you been? We've been trying to raise you for the past 10 minutes." 10 minutes? 3 hours on the island, 10 minutes in her own reality, just as her father had promised. "Search leader, I had radio problems. I'm showing clear skis and normal operations now. Request permission to return to base." "Roger that. We're 15 minutes out from the carrier. Form up on my starboard wing for approach." As she maneuvered into formation with the search aircraft, Raven could see the relief on Jackson's face through his canopy. But she could also see something else, a faint shimmer around his aircraft, like heat distortion but somehow more purposeful. The Night Raven's training kicked in automatically. Jackson was approaching one of the gaps, though he didn't know it yet. The awareness was subtle, like peripheral vision for reality itself. She could sense thin places in the world where physics grew uncertain, where determined pilots might find themselves somewhere impossible. Jackson's aircraft was drifting toward one of those places, drawn by the same instincts that had led her to pursue the ghost aircraft. "Search leader," she transmitted, making her voice casual. "Recommend heading adjustment to 070. I'm reading some atmospheric disturbance off your starboard wing." "Copy Raven, coming to 070. The subtle course change guided Jackson away from the gap, and the shimmer around his aircraft faded. He would never know how close he'd come to vanishing into mystery, but Raven would remember. This was what the night ravens did: quiet interventions, invisible protections, ensuring that only those truly ready for the impossible would find their way to the gaps. The Ford appeared on the horizon, its flight deck busy with recovery operations. As they entered the carrier's controlled airspace, Raven felt a strange mixture of belonging and displacement. This was her world, her life, her career, but now she knew it was only part of a larger story. Her landing was perfect, the aircraft settling onto the deck with practiced precision. As she rolled to a stop and began shutdown procedures, she caught sight of Chief Martinez watching from the flight line. For just a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something in his expression that told her she wasn't the only one aboard the Ford who knew about the gaps. Later, during the debrief, she would file a report about equipment malfunctions and atmospheric interference. Intelligence would classify her encounter as unexplained but non-threatening. The official record would show a routine search and rescue operation with no unusual incidents. But in the quiet of her stateroom that night, Raven would study her father's photograph and know that her real training was just beginning. The debriefing took place in Admiral Hendrick's private conference room, with only essential personnel present. Commander Garrett from Intelligence sat across from Raven, her expression carefully neutral as she reviewed the preliminary reports. "Let me understand this correctly, Lieutenant Commander," Garrett began. "You experienced complete radio failure, navigational system malfunction, and engine irregularities simultaneously, but all systems returned to normal function without any maintenance action." "That's correct, ma'am. I believe we encountered some form of atmospheric electromagnetic phenomenon, possibly related to solar activity interacting with the storm system." Raven's training in misdirection was proving useful. The night ravens had taught her that truth could be hidden inside truth. Electromagnetic phenomena did cause equipment failures, solar activity did create atmospheric disturbances, and storm systems did generate their own electrical fields. She wasn't lying exactly, just providing a framework that rational minds could accept. Admiral Hendricks leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. "Commander, in your professional assessment, does this incident represent a threat to flight operations?" "Unknown, sir. I recommend we monitor solar activity reports and correlate them with any future equipment anomalies. If there's a pattern, we should be able to predict when conditions might be hazardous." It was a perfect non-answer that shifted responsibility to natural phenomena, while establishing protocols that would protect other pilots who might encounter the gaps. Hendricks nodded approvingly. Raven had given him exactly what he needed to file a report that would satisfy higher command, without revealing anything truly sensitive. After the formal debriefing, Chief Martinez approached her in the corridor outside the conference room. His weathered face was carefully expressionless, but his eyes held depths of knowledge that reminded her of the night ravens. "Good flight today, Lieutenant Commander. Not everyone who goes looking for ghosts comes back with all their pieces intact." "Just equipment problems, Chief. Nothing more mysterious than bad weather and solar interference." Martinez smiled slightly. "Course it was, but if you ever find yourself dealing with unusual equipment again, remember that some of us old-timers have seen things that don't make it into the maintenance manuals." He handed her a small piece of paper with a frequency written in pencil. Emergency channel. Only works sometimes, only in certain conditions. But if you're ever really lost, it might help you find your way home. That evening, alone in her stateroom, Raven examined the frequency more closely. It wasn't in any standard communication band, too high for normal radio, too low for satellite. But somehow, she knew exactly what it was. The Night Raven's emergency frequency, the channel that connected their scattered operations across time and space. Her father had been right about time moving differently in the gaps. She'd spent subjective hours on the impossible island, learning about her heritage and her options, but only minutes had passed in normal reality. The choice she'd made, to return to her own world while maintaining the connection to the Night Ravens, was already proving complex. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Saw the news about your squadron's training exercise. Hope you're staying safe. Love you. Raven stared at the message for a long time. Her mother had spent 35 years wondering about her husband's fate, never knowing the truth about his disappearance. Now Raven faced the same burden of secrets, the same need to protect loved ones from knowledge they couldn't safely carry. But unlike her mother, she knew the truth. And unlike her father, she had a choice about how to carry that knowledge forward. Outside her porthole, the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere among them, her father and the Night Ravens continued their impossible missions. The next few weeks passed in a haze of routine operations, but everything felt different. Raven found herself hyper-aware of atmospheric conditions, equipment anomalies, and the subtle signs that indicated proximity to the gaps. She began maintaining a private log of incidents that didn't quite make sense. Radio transmissions from aircraft that weren't supposed to be in the area, radar contacts that appeared and vanished without explanation, weather patterns that seemed to move against prevailing winds. Most disturbing were the dreams. Every night she found herself back on the impossible island, walking through the hangar filled with aircraft from across time. Sometimes she was flying impossible missions, preventing mid-air collisions that hadn't happened yet, guiding lost pilots through storms that existed in parallel realities, intercepting messages that were being transmitted across decades rather than miles. She began to understand that her connection to the Night Ravens wasn't just theoretical. Part of her consciousness was already operating in the gaps, learning the skills she would need for missions that transcended normal physics. Her waking self maintained the facade of a normal naval aviator, but her sleeping mind was being trained for something far more complex. The first real test came during a routine training flight with Lieutenant Rodriguez. They were practicing combat air patrol patterns over the Pacific when Rodriguez's aircraft began experiencing electrical problems. His radio went dead, his navigation systems failed, and his backup instruments started displaying impossible readings. "Rodriguez, can you hear me?" Raven transmitted but got no response. Through her enhanced awareness, she could see what was happening. Rodriguez was drifting toward one of the gaps, his aircraft systems failing as reality became uncertain around him. In a few minutes, he would vanish from normal space, becoming another mysterious disappearance that would haunt his family for generations. Unless she intervened. Raven switched to the emergency frequency Chief Martinez had given her. "Night Watch, this is Raven. I have a pilot in distress approaching gap coordinates 77 Alpha. Request guidance." The response came immediately in her father's voice. "Raven, you have authorization to assist. Trust your instincts and remember, reality is more flexible than they teach in flight school." She accelerated toward Rodriguez's position, feeling her F-18 respond with capabilities that hadn't existed before her encounter with the Night Ravens. The aircraft moved through the air like it was cutting through dimensions rather than just atmosphere, and she found herself able to perceive layers of reality that normal instruments couldn't detect. Rodriguez's aircraft was shimmering at the edges, beginning to phase out of normal space. Raven pulled alongside and began flashing her navigation lights in a specific pattern, one she somehow knew would resonate with his failing systems and pull him back towards stable reality. The technique worked. Rodriguez's aircraft solidified, his systems stabilized, and his radio crackled back to life. "Raven, what the hell just happened? My instruments went crazy for a minute there." "Electromagnetic interference," she replied smoothly. "Probably atmospheric ducting from that storm system to the north. Let's head home and get your systems checked." As they flew back toward the carrier, Raven realized she'd just conducted her first Night Raven's mission. The intervention had been subtle, invisible, leaving no trace that anything extraordinary had occurred. Rodriguez would file a routine equipment malfunction report, and the official record would show nothing unusual. But she would remember, and somewhere in the gaps between realities, her father and the other Night Ravens would know that their newest member was learning to balance two worlds simultaneously. The pattern continued over the following months. Routine flights became opportunities for invisible guardianship, protecting pilots who pushed too close to the boundaries of the possible. Raven developed a reputation for uncanny situational awareness, an almost supernatural ability to predict weather problems, equipment failures, and navigation errors before they became critical. Her squadron mates began calling her Prophet, in addition to her official call sign, joking that she seemed to know what was going to happen before it did. But Commander Jackson noticed something else in her performance reports, a new depth of confidence, a sense that she was operating with knowledge that went beyond standard training. "Raven," he said one evening as they walked back from a mission briefing, "I've been flying for 20 years, and I've learned to trust my instincts about pilots. You've changed since that incident in the Aleutians. You're flying like someone who knows something the rest of us don't." She chose her words carefully. "The experience taught me to pay attention to subtle signs, equipment behaviors, atmospheric conditions, things that might indicate developing problems. I'm just being more observant." Jackson nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. The squadron's safety record has never been better." That night, as she lay in her bunk listening to the familiar sounds of the carrier, Raven felt the weight of her double life settling around her like a comfortable but complex garment. In the official world, she was Lieutenant Commander Mika Vasquez, a competent but not exceptional naval aviator with an inexplicable talent for avoiding disasters. But in the hidden reality of the gaps, she was something else entirely, a guardian between worlds, protecting pilots who flew too close to the impossible. The duality was becoming natural, like speaking two languages fluently. During the day, she filed routine reports and attended standard briefings. But at night, her dreams took her to the Night Raven's Island, where her father continued her training in techniques that had no names in any official manual. "The key," Eduardo explained during one of these nocturnal sessions, "is learning to see the layers of reality without losing your anchor in the primary layer. Most people who encounter the gaps either reject them completely or get lost in them entirely. We exist in the space between those extremes." The island had revealed more of its secrets during these visits. She learned that it existed in a fold of spacetime, accessible from any point where reality grew thin enough to permit passage. The Night Ravens used it as a base of operations, but their actual missions took place across the globe, across time itself when necessary. "Every reality has thin places," Morrison explained, showing her charts that mapped probability rather than geography. "Natural phenomena, storms, magnetic anomalies, gravitational irregularities, can create temporary gaps, but human consciousness can also thin the boundaries, especially when someone is pushing the limits of what's possible." The charts were beautiful and terrifying, showing the Earth as a web of interconnected possibilities rather than a simple sphere of matter and energy. Pilots who flew with absolute confidence, who pushed their aircraft beyond normal limits, who believed completely in their ability to transcend physics. They were the ones who found the gaps, whether they were looking for them or not. Your father was one of the naturals, Morrison continued. During the Vietnam War, he was performing combat maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible, surviving situations that should have killed him. Eventually, reality noticed him, and the gaps started opening in his presence. Raven studied her father's service record, the classified version that showed his true mission history. He'd been conducting reconnaissance flights over areas where the laws of physics seemed to behave differently, mapping locations where experimental aircraft had vanished without trace. The military had been aware of the gaps for decades, but they'd never understood how to navigate them safely. "They sent me to investigate the thin places," Eduardo said, appearing beside her as she read. What they didn't expect was that someone who approached the gaps with the right mindset could step through them and return. I was supposed to be gathering intelligence on anomalous phenomena. Instead, I became part of the phenomenon myself. The weight of family legacy pressed down on her shoulders. 3 generations of Vasquez aviators had encountered the impossible. Her grandfather had reported strange lights during World War II missions over the Pacific. Her father had vanished into the gaps during Vietnam. And now, she was carrying on a tradition that existed outside official recognition. "The choice is always yours," Eduardo reminded her. "You can return to normal reality permanently, let your connection to the gaps fade, live a conventional life. The Night Ravens would understand." But Raven knew she could never go back to not knowing. The hidden layer of reality was too important, the protection of lost pilots too necessary. Her enhanced awareness had already prevented a dozen potential tragedies, guiding aircraft away from dangerous conditions that conventional weather reports couldn't predict. She was exactly where she belonged, standing watch between the possible and the impossible. 6 months after her first encounter with the Night Ravens, Raven received orders for a special assignment. Admiral Hendricks called her to his office personally, his expression more serious than usual. "Lieutenant Commander, I'm assigning you to the Navy's Experimental Flight Test Program. You'll be working with prototype aircraft, testing systems that push the boundaries of current technology." The irony wasn't lost on her. The official Navy was placing her in exactly the position where she'd be most likely to encounter the gaps again, working with experimental aircraft that might spontaneously develop the ability to navigate between realities. "Sir, what kind of prototypes?" Hendricks handed her a classified folder. "Next-generation stealth technology, electromagnetic propulsion systems, experimental navigation equipment. The kind of projects that tend to produce unusual results." Inside the folder, she found photographs of aircraft that looked remarkably similar to her father's impossible plane. The resemblance was so strong that she wondered if the Night Ravens had been influencing military research and development for decades, slowly introducing technology from the gaps into conventional engineering. "The program is based at Edwards Air Force Base," Hendricks continued. "You'll be working with a joint service team, testing equipment that's classified several levels above your current clearance. But given your recent performance record and your apparent ability to handle unusual situations, you're our first choice for the assignment." That evening, she called her mother from the Secure Communications Center. Maria Vasquez sounded tired but proud when she heard about the new assignment. "Your father would be so proud," Maria said. "He always dreamed of flying the newest, most advanced aircraft. In a way, it's like you're continuing his work." If only she knew how literally true that was. The transfer to Edwards took 2 weeks to process, giving Raven time to adjust to the idea of leaving the Ford and her squadron behind. Jackson organized a farewell party in the Ready Room, and her fellow pilots presented her with a plaque commemorating her perfect safety record. "Prophet," Jackson said, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. May your legendary ability to avoid disasters serve you well in the world of experimental test flying. Try not to break any multi-billion-dollar prototypes. Chief Martinez appeared at her elbow as the party wound down. "Remember that emergency frequency I gave you," he said quietly. "It works better from desert locations if you ever need it." The implications of that comment would become clear soon enough. Her final night aboard the Ford, Raven stood on the flight deck watching the stars. Somewhere among those distant lights, she knew, other night ravens were conducting missions that normal reality would never acknowledge. Tomorrow she would begin a new chapter of her double life, testing aircraft that might spontaneously develop the ability to navigate between dimensions. The responsibility felt heavier now, but also more purposeful. She wasn't just protecting individual pilots anymore. She was helping to bridge the gap between conventional technology and the impossible capabilities that existed in the spaces between realities. Her father's voice whispered across the night air, "Ready for the next phase of training, Mija." She was. Edwards Air Force Base sprawled across the Mojave Desert like a monument to humanity's determination to conquer the sky. As Raven's transport aircraft descended toward the runway, she could see the famous dry lake beds where decades of experimental aircraft had pushed the boundaries of flight. This was where Chuck Yeager had broken the sound barrier, where the X-15 had touched the edge of space, where countless test pilots had risked everything to advance the art of aviation. It was also, she realized with her enhanced awareness, where reality grew thin on a regular basis. The electromagnetic anomalies were subtle but persistent, distortions in local spacetime that would be invisible to conventional instruments, but clearly detectable to someone trained by the night ravens. The desert environment, combined with decades of high-energy experimental flights, had created multiple microgaps that opened and closed unpredictably. Colonel Patricia Hawkins met her at the flight line, a veteran test pilot with silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Welcome to the edge of the impossible, Lieutenant Commander. I hope you're ready to redefine your understanding of what aircraft can do." The words carried more weight than Hawkins probably intended. As they walked toward the secure hangar complex, Raven noticed other signs that Edwards existed at the intersection of conventional and impossible reality. Certain hangars seemed to shimmer slightly in the desert heat. Surveillance cameras pointed at empty air, as if tracking aircraft that weren't quite visible, and the background electromagnetic field hummed with frequencies that suggested technology beyond current understanding. "Your first assignment," Hawkins explained, leading her into a hangar that was larger inside than outside, "is to evaluate the flight characteristics of the XF-47 experimental stealth fighter. It's incorporating some revolutionary propulsion concepts, and we need a pilot with exceptional situational awareness to safely explore its capabilities." The XF-47 sat in the center of the hangar like a metallic dream, its lines flowing so smoothly that it seemed to bend light around itself. But Raven could see deeper layers, energy patterns that suggested the aircraft existed partially in normal space and partially somewhere else entirely. The engineers had built a gap-capable aircraft without realizing what they'd accomplished. "Beautiful, isn't she?" said Dr. James Chen, the project's lead engineer, approaching from a bank of monitoring stations. "We've incorporated metamaterial surfaces that interact with electromagnetic fields in ways we're still trying to understand. The theoretical performance characteristics are remarkable, but we need practical flight data to validate our models." Raven walked around the aircraft, her enhanced senses mapping the places where it interfaced with other layers of reality. The propulsion system wasn't just advanced, it was tapping into the same forces that allowed the Night Raven's aircraft to navigate between dimensions. "What kind of performance characteristics are we expecting?" Chen consulted his tablet, excitement evident in his voice. "If our calculations are correct, it should be capable of sustained flight at velocities and altitudes that exceed anything in our current inventory. The electromagnetic drive system theoretically allows for maneuvers that would be impossible with conventional aerodynamics. That evening, in her temporary quarters, Raven used the emergency frequency to contact the night ravens. Her father's voice came through clearly despite the encryption that should have made the channel unintelligible. "The military is closer to understanding the gaps than we thought," she reported. "They're building aircraft that can navigate between realities, even if they don't realize what they're doing." "We've been watching the Edwards program," Eduardo replied. "Some of their breakthroughs are the result of recovered technology from pilots who never made it home from the gaps. Others are independent discoveries, human ingenuity finding its own path to the impossible." "What are my orders?" "Test the aircraft, but be prepared for anything. If it truly has gap capabilities, your first flight might take you places the engineers never intended. And remember, you may not be the only person at Edwards who knows about the hidden reality." As if to confirm her father's warning, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Chief Master Sergeant Rebecca Stone, a weathered woman whose eyes held the same depth of hidden knowledge she'd recognized in Chief Martinez. "Ma'am," Stone said quietly, "I understand you might be dealing with some unusual equipment behaviors during your test flights. If you need any off-the-books maintenance support, I've got 40 years of experience with aircraft that don't always follow the manual." Raven invited her in, recognizing a kindred spirit. "What exactly are we talking about, Sergeant?" Stone's smile was knowing. "Let's just say that desert flying can take you places that don't show up on any chart. And when you come back from those places, sometimes your aircraft needs the kind of maintenance that isn't covered in standard procedures." The network of hidden knowledge was larger than Raven had imagined, stretching across service branches and decades of experience. Tomorrow, she would take her first flight in an aircraft that might spontaneously develop the ability to navigate between dimensions, supported by ground crew who understood that reality was more flexible than most people realized. The next phase of her education was about to begin. The XF-47's first flight was scheduled for dawn, when atmospheric conditions were most stable and the desert was empty of civilian air traffic. Raven completed her pre-flight inspection with unusual care, knowing that conventional procedures might not be sufficient for an aircraft that existed partially in multiple realities. The cockpit felt familiar despite its advanced configuration. Holographic displays showing information that seemed to respond to her thoughts as much as her inputs, control surfaces that moved with fluid precision, and an overall sense that the aircraft was somehow aware of her presence. Edwards Tower, XF-47, requesting clearance for initial test flight. XF-47, you are cleared for takeoff. Proceed to restricted area R2508 for evaluation flights. Weather is clear, winds light and variable. As she advanced the throttles, the electromagnetic drive system engaged with a sound like singing crystal. The aircraft didn't accelerate so much as transition smoothly from stationary to flight, lifting off the runway with movements that seemed to ignore conventional physics. At 5,000 feet, she began the first series of evaluations: basic flight characteristics, control response, systems integration. Everything performed flawlessly, but there was an underlying sense that the aircraft was capable of far more than she was currently asking of it. Test Control, XF-47. Initial flight characteristics are nominal, requesting permission to explore upper performance envelope. Roger, XF-47. You are cleared to 50,000 feet. Be advised, we're showing some unusual atmospheric readings at altitude. As she climbed toward the stratosphere, Raven began to feel the familiar sensation of approaching one of the gaps. The aircraft's exotic systems were interacting with natural electromagnetic anomalies, creating a resonance effect that was thinning the boundaries of reality. At 45,000 feet, The XF-47's displays began showing impossible readings. According to the instruments, they were flying at 80,000 feet and climbing. Their speed was simultaneously Mach 2.3 and stationary, and their position was marked as both over Edwards and somewhere above the North Pacific. Test control, I'm showing some anomalous instrument readings. Request guidance. The response was immediate but strange. XF-47, we show you at assigned altitude and airspeed. Please confirm your instrument indications. Through her enhanced awareness, Raven could see what was happening. The aircraft was beginning to exist in multiple realities simultaneously, its exotic propulsion system creating interfaces with parallel versions of Earth where physics operated under slightly different rules. The ground controllers could only perceive the version of her flight that existed in their primary reality. She had a choice to make. She could throttle back, descend to safer altitudes, and file a report about equipment malfunctions. Or she could trust the XF-47 systems and see where they might take her. The decision was made easier by what appeared on her threat warning display. Multiple aircraft contacts approaching from the northwest, moving at impossible speeds and using technology that shouldn't exist. Someone else was operating gap-capable aircraft, and they weren't broadcasting friendly identification codes. "Night Watch, this is Raven," she transmitted on the emergency frequency. "I have multiple unknown contacts approaching. Request immediate support." Her father's voice came through clearly. "Raven, you're encountering the opposition. They're from a reality where the gaps were weaponized instead of protected. Do not engage directly. Use the XF-47's capabilities to evade until support arrives." The opposition. In all her training with the Night Ravens, she'd heard rumors about hostile forces from parallel realities, entities that used gap technology for conquest rather than protection. Now she was face to face with them, flying an experimental aircraft that might be humanity's first practical defense against interdimensional threats. The enemy aircraft were closing rapidly, their exotic signatures unlike anything in terrestrial databases. Raven pushed the XF-47 to its limits, feeling it respond by sliding sideways through reality itself, evading attacks that came from directions that didn't exist in normal space. The battle for the gaps had begun. The opposition aircraft moved like schools of metal fish, coordinating their attacks through dimensions that human tactics had never considered. Raven found herself flying not just in three-dimensional space, but through layers of reality that existed parallel to her own world. The XF-47 responded to her commands by shifting between these layers, its exotic propulsion system allowing maneuvers that violated every principle of conventional aerodynamics. "Raven, this is Night Leader," came a familiar voice, Morrison, the Korean War veteran she'd met on the Impossible Island. "We have 4 aircraft en route to your position. Hold your current dimensional coordinates and continue evasive maneuvers." Through her cockpit canopy, she could see the opposition forces clearly now. Their aircraft appeared to be constructed from materials that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating holes in reality that moved with predatory intelligence. Each one was piloted by a human figure, but something about their movements suggested they were no longer entirely human. "Test control, I am engaged with unknown hostiles," she transmitted on conventional radio, knowing the ground controllers could only perceive a fraction of what was happening. Requesting immediate assistance. The response was confused and delayed. "XF-47, we show no other aircraft in your vicinity. Please clarify your situation." She was fighting a battle that most of reality couldn't even perceive, using an aircraft that officially didn't have the capabilities she was employing. The irony was overwhelming. The military had built humanity's first practical defense against interdimensional threats, but they didn't understand what they'd created. One of the opposition aircraft managed to lock onto her position across multiple reality layers simultaneously. She felt rather than saw the weapon discharge, some form of energy that attacked the intersection points between dimensions, trying to trap her XF-47 in a collapsed pocket of spacetime. Raven rolled, inverted, and dove through what appeared to be empty air, but was actually a gap between parallel versions of Earth. The opposition aircraft followed, but their weapons were designed for warfare within single realities, not for pursuing targets through the maze of possibilities that existed between worlds. "Coming up on your 6, Raven," Morrison announced. "Brake left on my mark." She couldn't see his aircraft on any of her instruments, but she trusted the Night Raven's timing completely. "Braking left now." The Night Ravens materialized around her like guardian angels, their aircraft seeming to condense out of probability itself. Morrison's Korean war-era F-86 Sabre looked identical to museum displays, but it moved through space and time with fluid grace that belonged in no earthly conflict. The other 3 aircraft were equally anachronistic: a World War II P-51 Mustang, a Vietnam-era F-4 Phantom, and something that looked like it had been designed a century in the future. The battle joined across multiple layers of reality, with aircraft from different eras of aviation history engaging enemies that existed outside of history entirely. The opposition forces were skilled and ruthless, but they'd made a fundamental error in their tactics. They were fighting like conquerors rather than guardians, trying to impose their will on reality rather than working with its natural flows. "Follow my lead, Raven," Morrison called. "We're going to show them why protective instincts trump aggressive ones in gap warfare." The Night Ravens began flying in a formation that seemed random, but felt deeply purposeful. As they moved through the layers of reality, they were weaving something, a pattern that strengthened the barriers between dimensions instead of exploiting the weak points. The opposition aircraft found themselves increasingly isolated, trapped in probability pockets that cut them off from their support structures. One by one, the enemy aircraft began to fade from existence, not destroyed but displaced back to whatever reality had spawned them. The final opposition fighter attempted one last attack, diving toward Raven's XF-47 with weapon systems that could theoretically erase her from all possible timelines simultaneously. Morrison's Sabre intercepted the attack, its pilot accepting damage that would normally be fatal in order to protect the newest member of their unit. The Korean War veteran's aircraft began breaking apart across multiple dimensions, but his voice remained steady on the radio. "Tell them the Night Ravens are still watching, Raven, and tell them we're not the only ones anymore." As Morrison's aircraft faded from existence, taking the last opposition fighter with it, Raven found herself alone in the XF-47, flying through normal space above the Mojave Desert. Her instruments showed standard readings, her altitude was exactly where it should be, and test control was asking for routine status updates. But everything had changed. The military's experimental aircraft program had just produced humanity's first practical weapon against interdimensional threats, and she was the only person in official channels who understood what had really happened. The secret war for the gaps had entered a new phase. The debrief after her first XF-47 flight was unlike anything in her previous experience. Colonel Hawkins led the session, but Dr. Chen looked troubled as he reviewed the telemetry data, and Chief Master Sergeant Stone watched the proceedings with knowing eyes. "The aircraft performed beyond all expectations," Raven reported, sticking to observable facts while carefully omitting the interdimensional battle. "Flight characteristics are exceptional, and the electromagnetic propulsion system demonstrates capabilities that exceed theoretical predictions." Chen frowned at his data tablet. "We recorded some unusual electromagnetic signatures during the high-altitude phase of your flight, energy patterns that don't match our propulsion system models. Did you experience anything abnormal?" The question was carefully neutral, but Raven could sense deeper currents beneath it. Chen might not understand the gaps, but he was clearly aware that his aircraft had capabilities beyond its design parameters. "I encountered some atmospheric disturbances that required aggressive maneuvering," she replied. "The XF-47 handled everything I asked of it, but I recommend we investigate the source of those electromagnetic anomalies before the next test flight." Hawkins made notes on her tablet. "We've been detecting similar signatures from other experimental aircraft programs. There seems to be some form of environmental phenomenon affecting high-performance flight operations, but we haven't been able to isolate the cause." After the official debrief, Stone approached her in the corridor. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you about your aircraft's maintenance requirements. There are some things that don't show up in the telemetry but need attention after. Unusual flight profiles." They walked to a secure maintenance hangar where the XF-47 was undergoing post-flight inspection. Stone led her to a section of the aircraft that looked normal but felt different to Raven's enhanced senses. "The electromagnetic drive system creates structural stresses that conventional materials can't handle indefinitely," Stone explained quietly. "But we've developed some modifications that help the aircraft cope with extreme operating conditions, improvements that aren't in the official manual." She showed Raven components that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, circuit patterns that resembled the technology she'd seen on the Impossible Island, power conduits that hummed with frequencies that belonged in no earthly electromagnetic spectrum. "How long has this modification program been running?" Stone's smile was enigmatic. "Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, we've been preparing for situations like today's flight for about 30 years, ever since the first test pilot came back from a routine evaluation flight with stories about aircraft that weren't supposed to exist." The maintenance hangar contained 6 other experimental aircraft, all bearing the same subtle modifications. Raven realized she was looking at humanity's clandestine preparation for gap warfare, a program that existed in the spaces between official recognition, staffed by personnel who understood that reality was more flexible than most people realized. "The XF-47 isn't just an experimental aircraft," Stone continued. "It's a prototype for an entire new class of defensive systems. The Night Ravens have been helping us develop it, though most of the engineers don't know that." That evening, Raven contacted her father through the emergency frequency. "The military is farther along than we thought. They're building gap-capable aircraft deliberately now, not just accidentally." "We've been guiding their development for decades," Eduardo replied. "The opposition has been growing stronger, more organized. Humanity needs practical defenses against interdimensional threats, not just individual guardians." "What happened to Morrison?" Her father's voice carried a note of pride mixed with sorrow. "He chose to sacrifice his existence across all realities to protect you and preserve the secret of the XF-47's capabilities. Morrison always said that protecting the next generation was worth any personal cost." Raven felt the weight of that sacrifice settling on her shoulders. Morrison had given up not just his life, but his existence across all possible timelines, ensuring that the opposition couldn't use his capture to gain intelligence about human gap warfare capabilities. "What are my orders going forward?" "Continue the test program, but remember, you're not just evaluating aircraft anymore. You're training the first generation of humanity's dimensional defense pilots. The skills you develop, the tactics you pioneer, the technologies you help perfect, they'll determine whether humanity can protect itself when the opposition returns in force." Through her quarters window, Raven could see the lights of Edwards Air Force Base stretching across the desert. Each light represented someone working on the cutting edge of human technological achievement, pushing the boundaries of what aircraft could accomplish. Most of them had no idea they were actually developing weapons for a war that existed outside conventional reality. But some did know. And tomorrow, she would continue her double mission, officially testing experimental aircraft, unofficially preparing humanity for conflicts that most people couldn't even imagine. The Night Raven's newest mission was just beginning. Over the following weeks, the XF-47 test program intensified. Each flight pushed deeper into the aircraft's capabilities, and each flight brought new encounters with the gaps between realities. Raven began mapping the dimensional weak points over Edwards, creating charts that existed nowhere in official documentation, but were crucial for understanding when and where interdimensional threats might emerge. Dr. Chen's engineering team made breakthrough after breakthrough, though they attributed their insights to conventional research rather than the Night Raven's subtle guidance. The XF-47 systems evolved with each test flight, incorporating improvements that seemed to emerge spontaneously from the aircraft's interaction with exotic electromagnetic fields. "It's almost like the aircraft is learning," Chen confided to Raven after a particularly successful flight. "The neural network controlling the propulsion system is developing responses to situations we never programmed into it, adaptive behaviors that exceed our wildest expectations for artificial intelligence development." Raven nodded thoughtfully, knowing that the XF-47 wasn't just learning from conventional experience. Each time it navigated the gaps, it was interfacing with information structures that existed outside normal spacetime, essentially downloading knowledge from parallel versions of itself that had developed in slightly different realities. The aircraft was becoming something unprecedented, a machine that could learn from its own alternative existence, incorporating capabilities from versions of itself that had never been built in this timeline. The implications were staggering and completely invisible to anyone without Night Raven's training. Meanwhile, the opposition hadn't given up. Their attacks became more subtle, more carefully coordinated with natural phenomena that could provide cover for interdimensional operations. Raven found herself flying combat air patrol missions that officially didn't exist, protecting experimental aircraft from threats that couldn't be acknowledged. The strain was beginning to show. Balancing her official duties as a test pilot with her unofficial role as an interdimensional guardian was exhausting, and the constant vigilance required to detect opposition activities was wearing down her mental defenses. Colonel Hawkins noticed during their weekly evaluation meeting, "Raven, you're performing exceptionally well, but you look like you haven't been sleeping. Are the physical demands of the test program becoming too much?" The question was both genuine concern and subtle probing. Hawkins had been a test pilot for 25 years, and she developed instincts for recognizing when pilots were dealing with stresses beyond normal flight operations. "I'm fine, ma'am. Just adapting to the unique characteristics of gap-capable, electromagnetically advanced aircraft systems." Hawkins' eyes sharpened at the verbal slip. "Gap-capable, that's an interesting term for describing the XF-47's performance envelope." Raven realized she'd made a potentially serious error. The terminology of interdimensional warfare was becoming so natural to her that she'd almost revealed classified information that officially didn't exist. "I was referring to performance gaps in our understanding of the aircraft's capabilities, ma'am. The XF-47 consistently performs beyond theoretical predictions." "I see." Hawkins made a note, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely satisfied with the explanation. "Raven, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Have you encountered anything during your test flights that you haven't included in your official reports?" The moment of truth had arrived. Raven could maintain the facade of conventional test flying, or she could trust that Hawkins might be ready to learn about the hidden reality that existed parallel to official military operations. "Colonel, if I were to answer that question honestly, would the conversation remain confidential?" Hawkins studied her for a long moment. then reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a small device that Raven recognized as a white noise generator designed to defeat electronic surveillance. "This conversation is completely off the record, Lieutenant Commander. Now tell me what you've really been doing up there." The truth, when it finally emerged, was both liberating and terrifying to share with someone outside the Night Raven's inner circle. Hawkins listened to Raven's account without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When the story concluded, she sat in silence for several minutes, processing information that redefined everything she thought she knew about experimental flight operations. "Let me see if I understand correctly," she finally said. "You're telling me that experimental aircraft can spontaneously develop the ability to navigate between parallel realities, that hostile forces from alternate dimensions are actively attacking our test programs, and that there's a secret organization of pilots from across military history protecting us from threats we can't officially acknowledge." "That's an accurate summary, ma'am." Hawkins opened her desk drawer again, this time withdrawing a photograph that made Raven's heart skip. It showed a group of pilots standing in front of aircraft that looked suspiciously like Night Raven's equipment, all wearing flight suits with the distinctive Raven insignia she'd seen on the Impossible Island. "This was taken at Edwards in 1954, Hawkins said quietly. "My grandfather, Colonel William Hawkins, is third from the left. According to family stories, he was involved in something called the Shadow Squadron, experimental flights that weren't quite experimental, testing aircraft that weren't quite aircraft, fighting an enemy that wasn't quite human." The photograph was proof that the Night Raven's presence at Edwards went back decades, that the integration of gap warfare capabilities into official military research had been a long-term project involving multiple generations of pilots and engineers. "Your grandfather was Night Raven's." "Apparently. He disappeared during a test flight in 1955, officially listed as killed in action when his aircraft crashed in the desert. But my grandmother always insisted he wasn't dead, just elsewhere. She kept receiving letters from him for years afterward, postmarked from places that didn't exist on any map." Hawkins opened a locked filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder marked with classifications that were higher than Raven's current security clearance. "I've been documenting anomalous incidents for my entire career, waiting for someone who could provide context for what I was observing. Equipment failures that weren't failures, aircraft that performed beyond physical possibility, pilots who returned from routine flights with knowledge they couldn't have acquired through normal means." The folder contained decades of carefully compiled evidence that reality was more complex than official channels acknowledged. Test flights that had encountered impossible weather patterns, radar contacts that didn't correlate with any known aircraft, electromagnetic anomalies that suggested the presence of technology beyond current understanding. "Ma'am, are you asking to be briefed into the Night Raven's program?" Hawkins smiled grimly. "Lieutenant Commander, I'm asking to be returned to the Night Raven's program. My grandfather trained me for this possibility my entire life, though I never fully understood what he was preparing me for until now." She stood up and walked to a wall safe that Raven hadn't noticed before, inputting a combination that opened the mechanism to reveal equipment that definitely wasn't standard issue. Flight suits with integrated systems for navigating dimensional transitions, helmets with displays that could track multiple layers of reality simultaneously, communication gear that operated on frequencies outside normal electromagnetic spectrum. "Welcome to the Shadow Squadron, Raven. The official test program was always just cover for our real mission, preparing humanity's defenses against interdimensional threats." As Hawkins suited up in equipment that looked decades ahead of current technology, Raven realized that her double life was about to become significantly more complicated. The line between official and unofficial reality was blurring, and the secret war for the gaps was moving into a new phase that would require unprecedented cooperation between military channels and the Night Raven's hidden operations. The next morning brought a crisis that tested every aspect of their combined capabilities. Multiple aircraft from different experimental programs across the country had simultaneously developed gap navigation abilities, creating a cascade failure in the barriers between realities. Opposition forces were pouring through the breaches, and conventional military responses were proving completely ineffective. Raven, Shadow Leader, Hawkins called over the emergency frequency. We have hostile interdimensional incursions at Edwards, Nellies, Wright-Patterson, and Pax River. The opposition is making a coordinated strike against all major test facilities simultaneously. Through her cockpit canopy, Raven could see the sky filled with aircraft that defied classification, opposition fighters that moved like living shadows, experimental human aircraft struggling to control their newfound dimensional capabilities, and Night Raven's units materializing from probability streams to engage the hostile forces. The battle for Earth's dimensional sovereignty was no longer secret. Every major military installation with experimental aircraft programs was under attack by forces that existed outside conventional reality, and only the pilots who could navigate the gaps between worlds had any hope of defending against the assault. "All units, this is Night Watch Actual," came her father's voice over the command frequency. "Execute Operation Convergence. It's time to bring the Shadow War into the light." Across the globe, Night Raven's units that had operated in secret for decades began revealing themselves to military commands that had never acknowledged their existence. Pilots who had been listed as missing or killed in action returned from the gaps to take command of aircraft that officially couldn't perform the maneuvers they were executing. The hidden reality was becoming visible, and humanity's survival depended on how quickly conventional military forces could adapt to fighting a war that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Raven engaged her first opposition fighter over the Mojave Desert, using tactics that combined traditional air combat with techniques that had no names in any official manual. The enemy aircraft was fast and maneuverable, but it was designed for conquest rather than protection, and that fundamental difference in purpose made it vulnerable to defensive strategies. "Target right, break high," she called to Hawkins, who was flying an aircraft that appeared to be a standard F-16, but moved with capabilities that belonged in no conventional fighter jet. Together, they executed a maneuver that existed in 4 dimensions simultaneously, trapping the opposition fighter in a probability loop that forced it back to its own reality. The technique was exhausting and dangerous, but it was also decisive. The enemy aircraft simply ceased to exist in their time stream, displaced back to whatever parallel Earth had spawned it. But for every opposition fighter they destroyed or displaced, 2 more seemed to emerge from the gaps. The enemy had been preparing for this assault longer than anyone had realized, building up forces across multiple realities and coordinating their attack through dimensions that human intelligence agencies couldn't monitor. "Shadow Leader, I'm reading massive energy buildups at 6 primary locations." Dr. Chen's voice came over the tactical frequency. "Whatever they're doing, it looks like they're trying to create permanent breaches in dimensional barriers." The implications were terrifying. If the opposition succeeded in establishing permanent gateways between realities, they could pour through unlimited reinforcements while preventing human forces from using gap navigation techniques for defense. "Night Watch Actual, Shadow Leader. We need immediate reinforcement from all available Night Raven's units. The opposition is attempting to establish permanent inter